Hello everyone, my name is Jenna, but you guys can call me Jen. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome to a little cozy fantasy discussion video. It's also a recommendation video, so don't worry, there's going to be lots of recs in here. And it's also going to cover some cozy fantasy books that I have yet to read that I really want to. But I feel like it's high time I talk about cozy fantasy books on my channel other than in a vlog situation. Because if you guys have been on my channel for a little while, you know I've done 2 different vlog situations where I've tried to find more cozy fantasy books after I fell in love with Legends and Lattes with Travis Baldree early last year. And it's fitting because I wrote my own, and that is officially out in the world. A Second Story by me, J.A. Collignon, or Collignon, however you want to say it, is out officially as of yesterday. I cannot believe it. But yes, this quick pitch is a queer cozy fantasy set by the sea where 2 adventurers, Ari and Finn, decide to buy a bookstore by the sea and live their best lives together. There's a little bit of found family. There's, established relationship, sort of. There's, it all started when their eyes met over a John Dagger kind of a thing. And there's also, the HGTV Reno vibe of having a bookstore. I love it, and I really hope you guys do too. There is going to be a companion sequel coming out this fall, date to be announced. That one's called A Little Luck, and it is a sapphic cozy fantasy, which I'm very excited about. But yes, recommendation number 1 is my own book, so there you go. But today, we're going to talk about cozy fantasy. So, first and foremost, what even is cozy fantasy? I couldn't really tell you because we don't know. It is so new on the internet, and it's a very internet-based thing, this whole term cozy fantasy. The better known one probably is cozy mystery novels. That one's probably one of the more well-known genres with the cozy subset on the outside, But yes, so cozy fantasy specifically, I think as a consensus, we could probably all say it has something to do with the vibes that the books give off, which, vibes are very subjective. It doesn't really give us a strict, this is what it is, But then when you start thinking about any kind of genre or subgenre, are there really any strict lines as to what they need to be included in that genre? Who knows? That's a whole other conversation for another day. We're talking about cozy fantasy. So because cozy fantasy can fit in specific vibes, and it's really just a vibe of like feeling really at home, wrapped warm, something really cozy, something really heartwarming, just something that doesn't really, fit in like dark fantasy or like really high stakes fantasy. It's a little bit softer, it's a little bit more subtle. And in my opinion, it usually includes slightly lower stakes than a regular fantasy novel. And it usually makes me at least feel like I'm wrapped in a really warm blanket. I love it. I love it so much. So today I'm going to talk about 3 kind of categories, and then I'm going to talk about some books that I have yet to read, specifically in kind of each of those categories. I don't know, it's going to be kind of a mess because, again, how do you classify cozy fantasy? How do you classify cozy fantasy? Please let me know in the comments. I would love to know. I have heard on the internet a few people trying to define cozy fantasy in different ways or kind of give it different categories. I believe I heard someone on TikTok say that there is like Hobbit cozy and then like Nazgul cozy. So we have those kind of things, and I've kind of taken that idea and kind of thought about it in my head, the Nazgul versus Hobbit cozy, and I think that's very true. There are different levels to the stakes of a fantasy novel that makes it cozy, in my opinion. But we're gonna start with some middle grade. So I have this lovely stack of middle grade books, 2 of which I have not yet read, but 3 that I have. And I think they're all kind of cozy in their own way. The first one that I'm gonna talk about is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones, because this one seems to be one of the ones that's always talked about when people are talking about cozy fantasy. They mention Howl's Moving Castle. I don't know whether that's because the Studio Ghibli movie has kind of given it this level of just like a national treasure. And like everyone just absolutely adores it. This book for sure, I think, counts because it's not super intense. It's gentle. There's a lot of interesting kind of weird magic going on. It definitely has a little bit of an interesting vibe to itself. And I will say the book is quite different from the movie itself, but I think both movie and book give off a similar vibe. So we'll say that Howl's Moving Castle does work as a cozy fantasy for sure. I don't know what it is. I think a lot of middle grades could definitely count as cozy fantasy, but a lot of them really don't. Like if you look at the action that's in most fantasy middle grades, it is so high stakes, so fast, very high octane, because a lot of middle grade is paced in a way where kids won't get bored, right? they just keep reading because it's so exciting and so amazing, and they just can't put it down. So in that sense, that's definitely not cozy. That's something that keeps you on the edge of your seat. But this one doesn't. It's a little bit slower. It's a little bit more cozy, and it's like, it's just kind of holding you very nicely and keeping you safe, kind of a vibe. That's what I get from Howl's Moving Castle. This is about, if you don't know what it's about Sophie, who is the daughter of a hat maker, one of the daughters of a hat maker, I believe. At some point in time, she gets cursed by this witch person to look old. So she suddenly looks old, and she decides to just up and leave because she's like, well, all right, I guess I'm old now, so nothing matters. And she's gonna leave, and she ends up getting kind of chased by a scarecrow and led slightly toward the moving house or the moving castle that is owned by the wizard Howl. And so she ends up joining this moving house. She joins this as their cleaning lady and ends up having adventures and stuff like that. So it's cute, soft, not too high octane, but it still does have some intrigue and keeps you going. And I really like this one. In that same vein, I would also suggest the Pages & Co. series. I've only read the first one, Tilly and the Book Wanderers, because it is just such a lovely, soft middle grade. It is a little bit younger middle grade than, say, like a Percy Jackson book would be, but this was just so enjoyable, and it feels like you're just sitting down in a really warm library with a fire, kind of like in an old English town somewhere that's like cutesy and just cozy. You're just wrapped in a blanket, that kind of a thing. You're going on adventures in books. That's what this feels like. So this follows 11-year-old Tilly, who learns that she has the ability to book wander, and she's also kind of working through the mystery of her missing mother. And she, you know, makes friends with Anne of Green Gables and Alice in Wonderland. These characters can come in and out of books, and she can go in and out of books as well. It's just lovely. And again, it has that cozy, I think it's a literary feeling that really gives this one that element to it. And this one is probably the least fantastical on this list, except for maybe one of the mentions that I have for the adult books. But the least fantastical, the only magical aspect of this is being able to travel in books, which is pretty magical in my opinion, but it's a little bit more contemporary. Then we have this really cute little graphic novel called Garlic and the Vampire by Brie Paulson. And this one is so sweet. I don't know, it's just so sweet, so soft, so kind. Even though our main character, Garlic, is super anxious and ends up being pushed onto this quest that she does not want to be on, it ends up being really soft and sweet and lovely by the end of it. It's a community feeling with all the vegetables and the witch that kind of like looks after them and the vampire that she ends up meeting. It's so lovely. But yeah, I think that's all I will tell you about Garlic and the Vampire. It's a graphic novel. It's very small. Also, the images are just lovely and pastoral. The art is fantastic. It just has a cozy farm vibe, and I think that gives it a perfect cozy fantasy leaning. Then there are two here on my list that I have not yet read, but I've heard other people say they are cozy fantasy, or they've ended up on cozy fantasy lists. And they are Redwall by Brian Jacques and The Ogress and the Orphans by Kelly Barnhill. Now, Kelly Barnhill is an author who wrote When Women Were Dragons and The Girl Who Drank the Moon, so she's pretty well known. Apparently, both of these are both kind of sweet and soft in their own way. I feel like Redwall is more traditional fantasy, which kind of lends a cozy fantasy vibe to it anyways when you're talking about traditional fantasy, which is something that I will talk about more when I get to some of the adult fantasy picks. I think that's what this one gives off, and it gives like a traditional, I don't know, not super high stakes kind of a quest adventure vibe that makes it feel cozy almost inherently. And then this one is actually quite cozy and lovely. But yeah, both of these are books that I would love to read. After that, let's dive into the just straight up, this is what you think of when you think of cozy fantasy books. And you know, I could not do this without mentioning Legends and Lattes, the OG, not necessarily the OG, but like the one that really started this internet phenomenon about cozy fantasy. And it's inspired so many different people to write in cozy fantasy. Legends and Lattes is absolutely wonderful. It's my favorite book from last year, one of my favorite books of all time. It's so lovely. It's about Viv, who is an orc who decides to stop adventuring, stop killing, retire, put up her sword and open up a coffee shop in a town that has never even heard of coffee. And it's sweet and gentle, and you meet Thimble, who is this little ratkin who becomes their baker, and you meet Tandri, who becomes her business partner. Not really, she's not a business partner, but she works at the cafe as well. It's lovely. There's a little bit of a sapphic romance in this as well, which we love. It's just, it's so perfect. This makes you want to drink coffee as you're reading it, so I will tell you about that. I will warn you about that. And then one of my other favorite books of all time, The Very Secret Society of Irregular Wishes by Sangu Mandana. This one is probably the most, other than Pages and Co., the most like real world kind of stuff, because this is set in the real world. It just has witches in it as well. And this is about Mika Moon, who ends up being a kind of a tutor nanny for these 3 little girls who are witches, and she's trying to teach them magic. And in this, she falls in love with the librarian there, and it's a grumpy sunshine romance. But I think what really gets me, like, this probably is more of a cozy fantasy romance in a way, but not in the way that people think of fantasy romance, you know? It's a romance book with fantasy elements to it, more so than anything like the X-Hex or any of those. This just is perfection. This book is one of my favorites in the entire world. I love it so much. And I think what really makes this one cozy is the atmosphere and the descriptions of everything in it. It's just, the magic is described so beautifully in this, and so straightforward and just so lovely. And there's nothing more cozy than the found family vibe, in my opinion, because that is my favorite trope. And this one has that to the max. Then we also have Can't Spell Treason Without Tea by Rebecca Thorne. So this is kind of leaning more into the little bit more action-packed cozy fantasy, even though this is about Reina and Chiante, who decide to open up a tea in a bookstore together. They decide to leave their lives and do so. It includes dragon aerial fights. It includes a little bit of treason. It's a little bit more high stakes than Legends and Lattes was, but it falls in that same kind of realm with both, my book and Legends and Lattes. So it definitely has the cozy vibes to it, and it was definitely very enjoyable. On this same note, I do have the sequel, which I have not yet read, which is The Pirate's Life for Tea. And this apparently is even a little bit more action-packed, but it's still cozy in some way. This is more of a pirating cozy fantasy, if you will. And if you have pirates in fantasy books, it's going to be a little bit more action. But I trust Rebecca Thorne that this is cozy, so I'm excited to get to this one as well. I didn't super love this one. I gave it 3.5 stars, but it's definitely really enjoyable, and I seem to be in the minority of that, so I think you guys will really like this one, and I'm excited to get to the sequel because I think this one will be even more up my alley because it's got pirates, and I love that. But yeah, it's with the descriptions, it's with the vibes, it's with the setting. There's something about cozy fantasy across all of them that I just think works, and it sets an atmosphere of coziness when you're reading. Continuing that on, let's talk about the ones that are a little bit more action-packed. So this one here is A Natural History of Dragons by Marie Brennan, and the inclusion of the rest of the series. I only have books 1 to 4 on my shelves, but I believe there are 5 or 6 in the whole thing, and I've only read the first 2, but they're both really great. They're a little bit more action-packed cozy fantasies in my opinion, but these feel like almost Regency era or Victorian era. A woman traveling, and it's her biography. This also, I guess, feels more like real life than most of these fantasy books. It feels like a Victorian woman going about documenting her scientific findings, except she's studying dragons. So that's your fantastical element to it. And I think these are just so lovely. They have a sense of the same feeling that like a Jane Austen novel gives me, just that general comfort of being, swaddled in something gentle and safe. And you know that our main character is always going to be safe because she's narrating these books from being elderly or older, way after she's done all these escapades. So she knows, she's always safe, not necessarily for the people that she's with. So it is a little bit higher stakes in that sense, but the vibes, cozy. Same thing with these two. Both cozy vibes, but more action-packed. So of course we're gonna have to talk about The Hobbit, because this, out of most of the traditional fantasy books, like I was talking about with Redwall, give off the cozy vibes because they remind us of the old school fantasy books that we were reading as kids. I don't know what it is. Something about these old school fantasy books just have a sense of nostalgia to them, and I think that is what gives the cozy vibes in my opinion. The Hobbit, of course, is about a journey. It's got a lot of action. It's got a lot of stuff that goes on. There's a dragon fight at the end, full war, full battle kind of a thing, but it's gentle. It's the Hobbit. It's like a combination of both the Hobbit and the Nazgul cozy fantasy, in my opinion, because you have, of course, the Shire at the beginning, which is what the Hobbit cozy fantasy is. But then you also have the Nazgul cozy, which is when they're actually going on the adventure and dealing with all these different things and getting into a bunch of scrapes and that kind of stuff that you would do on a traditional quest narrative. Yeah, I think that's why the Hobbit really works for that. It's just, there's something about the Hobbit. It feels cozy, it feels lovely to read. It's not as stress-inducing as the Lord of the Rings is, even though the Lord of the Rings, especially the Fellowship of the Ring, has such a long period of time where they are in the Shire. There's that general sense of dread throughout the Lord of the Rings because you don't know what's happening. You don't really, well, if you've reread it, of course you do, but you don't really know like what kind of dangers could be lurking out there. This one just feels a little bit more safe, even though it's still an adventure novel and people do die. It just, I don't know, it's like cozy fantasy with a little bit of an edge. which brings me to Nettle Bone, of course, by T. Kingfisher. Another one of my favorites. This has such a cozy fantasy vibe to me, and I believe I was talking to someone in my comments who was like surprised that I call this a cozy fantasy when they would call it a dark fairy tale. And honestly, I think dark fairy tales fit in the cozy fantasy vibe, because again, with the nostalgia that you have from the Hobbit style traditional fantasy books, you get that from fairy tales. So this one, as well as like the Bone Houses by Emily Lloyd Jones, they have like, and that one's a horror fantasy, but it gives me cozy vibes because of the fairy tale aspect to them. But this one specifically is about a princess turned nun turned savior of her sister, because her sister married someone like Joffrey from Game of Thrones. Awful man. But our main character, ends up teaming up with a couple people and they go on this little rescue mission. And it's just, I don't know, again, it's the descriptions, it's the atmosphere, it's the setting that is created by these books, and having that like dark fairy tale vibe to it gives it a cozy vibe. I don't know why. Maybe you guys know why. If you do, please let me know in the comments, but books like this definitely feel cozy to me. So I think they should be called cozy fantasy. Again, this is probably more at the Nazgul end of the spectrum because it is sharper, a little bit more stakes. It deals with some darker themes, but it's a lot more dark than like Legends and Lattes on the other end. Like these would be on each end of the spectrum kind of a thing, in my head, at least. Anyway, so those are some of the books that I have read. Now I'm going to talk about ones that I really do want to read, but first we're going to talk about the ones that I don't really know what category they land in. I've just heard them spoken of as cozy, so we'll see. But yeah, so first and foremost, we have The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison, and I think this one's like The Hobbit, where it falls into that category of traditional feeling fantasy. Maybe it's a little bit more character-led than like plot-heavy than most fantasy is, but yeah, I don't really know much about this. Apparently it follows the youngest son of the emperor. I mean, it's tagged on the back as a vividly imagined fantasy of deadly court intrigue, but I've heard that this one is just a little bit more character-driven and softer, so it feels cozier, so I'm thinking it's probably in line of the like Nazgul fantasy, traditional fantasy vibes. It just make you feel cozy. A River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross, I've also heard is cozy. I couldn't tell you why though. Again, it's described as a vivid fantasy, so maybe that's what it is. It's the vibes, it's the atmosphere, it's the description, the vivid nature of the worlds that make you feel like you're living in the world with the characters in such a way that it feels really comforting, and that kind of a vibe. So I'm getting that vibe from these books because, I don't know, vivid is a very good descriptor for them. Then we have more probably actual cozy fantasy. This one's probably a question mark, but I've heard people say that Brandon Sanderson has written a cozy fantasy with Tress of the Emerald Sea, which I love. And this one, oh, I just remembered another one that I could recommend, and that's The Princess Bride. So that one again has the traditional fantasy feeling, but in a storybook nature, so that it makes it feel more nostalgic and recognizable and friendly and lovely, even though the stakes are kind of high. It feels cozy. But this, Brandon Sanderson was inspired by watching The Princess Bride with his wife, and his wife was like, Buttercup did nothing. And why is she so like, you know, agency-less? So Brandon Sanderson went, all right, and wrote basically the same kind of a vibe. This wonderful, you know, adventure story where Tress has to go save her love because of that. And he wrote it for his wife, which I think is lovely. I have yet to read this, but I'm so excited to. I think it's just going to be the perfect cozy fantasy with like the leanings of a Brandon Sanderson, which you guys know I love Brandon Sanderson. So I'm really excited for this. And then we have these three boys. We have Miss Percy's Pocket Guide to the Care and Feeding of British Dragons by Quenby Olson. This is one that I got partway through previously when I was reading a bunch of cozy fantasy books for a vlog. I was in a weird reading place and this book just wasn't helping at the time, but I do really want to get to it at some point because it is literally Cranford with dragons. So Cranford is a classic novel, right? It's the same vibes as like, you know, the natural history of dragons kind of a thing, where you have a woman in the Victorian era vibe, almost Edwardian era vibe, you know, that kind of old vibe where, you know, women have to be married to mean anything. But it's about Mildred Percy, Miss Percy, who finds a dragon egg and ends up having to raise it with the help of her like local parishman, the vicar, that's what it's called. This is one that I do intend on re-picking up and reading at some point. I also have this self-published book, which is called The Bookshop and the Barbarian, which I am so amped by just from this cover and from that title. So it's talking about a shop called the Cozy Quill Bookshop. I'm excited, and it's little, so hopefully this one's also cozy in some kind of a way. And then of course I have the Encyclopedia of Fairies, no, Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. This one I've heard so many mixed things about, but I think it's right up my alley. It's written in an epistolary format, which is letters and journal entries and stuff about Emily Wilde, who is a scholar and she's going around learning about them, I believe. Her dashing and insufferably handsome academic rival, Wendell Bambleby. I love it. But yeah, it's got the small town vibes, which again, I think it's about setting. It's about atmosphere. It's about the vividness, if you're to take from the descriptions of those two fantasy books that I talked about earlier, to really paint the scene of these cozy fantasy books. Hello friends, later Jenna popping in, literally an hour after I filmed that video. After I filmed this video, I'm popping in because I had written a whole sticky note of books that I don't currently own that I was going to include in this video, and I didn't. So I'm going to talk about them now. There's 3 of them that I have not yet read. 2 of them because they're not released yet. Well, I do have an arc for one of them, so I do plan on reading it very soon. And then one that is out and about. So, Son of a Sailor by Marshall J. Moore comes out May 25th, but I'm really excited about. It's a cozy pirate fantasy, which we love to see. Cursed Cocktails by S.L. Rowland is about, I believe, a gay couple who ends up owning a bar, I do believe. So that one is already out and about. And Bard City Blues by Nathaniel Webb currently is under Kickstarter, and that's one that I have a arc for that I'm very excited to get into and read. So yes, add those 3 to your list. I'm so excited. That is pretty much it from me, my friends. I am now surrounded by a mess of books, but I love fantasy so much. You guys know that is my genre. When I was introduced to cozy fantasy specifically, there was just something so lovely about it. So home feeling, so just gentle, and it's so lovely to be able to read books like this and understand or know as you're going through that you don't have to be stressed out about what can happen at the end of a chapter for like cliffhangers and stuff. You're going in knowing it's softer, it's gonna treat you like you're just on a journey. And I think that is wonderful when you're talking about cozy fantasy or fantasy in general. I love it so much. Let me know down below your opinions on cozy fantasy. Let me know if you have any more recommendations as to books you think should be classified as cozy fantasy. I hope you all have a lovely, lovely day. Remember that my book, A Second Story, is now live in the world. You guys can go buy it now. I hope you all absolutely adore it as much as I do. And look out for A Little Luck coming very soon. And announcements for A Little Luck coming very soon. That's it for me. I will catch you in another video very soon. Stay kind and keep on reading.